Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Kristen.
And my name is Katie. And we want to spend a few minutes a day with you walking through the New Testament, one chapter at a time. This year, we will fix our gaze upon Christ so that we may know him, not only with our minds, but with our hearts.
Together, we will learn that who Jesus is changes everything.
Hey friends, welcome back to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Katie, and together we are walking through the New Testament in a year. Currently, we are studying 1 Corinthians, and today we will be in 1 Corinthians 11. As always, you can follow along with the Behold studies in the Daily Grace Co-shop or with the reading plans linked in the show notes. Today and in the next few chapters, Paul will continue to address a few issues sparking division within the Corinthian church. In chapter 11, Paul will address issues that have risen up within gatherings of the church, head coverings on women in the church, and the abuse of the Lord's Supper. Then in chapters 12 through 14, Paul will address spiritual gifts. As we get into chapter 11 and discuss head coverings, it's important to know that this is a highly debated topic. Great theologians and scholars come to different conclusions on what Paul is saying here. So if you read today's chapters and feel confused, join the club. This chapter is even more difficult from our modern perspective. If you were to look around your church on a Sunday morning, it's not likely you see a room full of women with covered heads. It's not the standard in today's time. But in the first century church, women covering their head in public was a normal practice. In fact, Paul says that this is customary of the early church in general in verse 16. Again, scholars debate what exactly is going on here, but it seems that women in Corinth were perhaps taking their Christian liberty to mean that they can defy cultural norms and remove their head coverings in worship services. But this expression of freedom could be misinterpreted because a lack of head covering in the first century was associated with sexual availability. New believers would see a woman without a head covering in church and may be confused about what values Christians do and do not uphold. So too, women appearing available disrespects the union between a husband and a wife, a union that is important not only in church, but to God. Another reason why Paul may have instructed the Corinthian women to wear head coverings is that these were culturally appropriate symbols of maleness and femaleness in the day. By adhering to these standards, the church was honoring and celebrating God's good design of creating men and women beautifully unique. On the surface, this chapter may have been a bit hard to take in. So I don't want you to miss the fact that Paul is affirming women praying and prophesying in the church in verse 4. He is encouraging a woman's participation in worship. And likely, this was frowned upon in the first century church when women held less rights than men. That means that Paul wants wives to participate in a way that honors their oneness with their husbands, which in turn glorifies God. Paul is upholding a woman's freedom to participate in worship within the cultural context of their day. Most scholars conclude that head coverings are not a practice we need to adhere to in the modern church, but there is still an application for us. How we dress, speak, and conduct ourselves within the church can impact how others view Christ. For those in the first century church, head coverings were a way for women to honor their husbands. And in our context today, we can ask ourselves, is my outer appearance bringing honor to God? We must especially ask this question in God's house. Is the way I'm acting or dressing distracting others from Jesus? Am I being an on-ramp to Christ or a roadblock? Secondly, in this chapter, Paul addresses a major issue in regard to the Lord's Supper in the Corinthian church. First, let's remind ourselves of what the Lord's Supper is. In Jesus' final meal with his disciples before he was arrested, they celebrated Passover, and Jesus instituted a tradition that symbolically honors his sacrifice at Calvary. Sometimes we call it communion. We see this account in all of the synoptic gospels, Matthew 26, Mark 14, and Luke 22. Jesus broke bread and told his disciples it represented the body broken for him. As he passed the cup of wine around, he said that it represents the blood of the covenant, poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Today we take communion to remember Christ's sacrifice and the life we have in his name. The early church participated in this tradition too, but the Corinthians were taking it for granted. Apparently, the wealthy in the church were not allowing the poor the same access to bread and wine of the communion that they had. They were sitting down and getting their fill and leaving little for the poor in the church who were hungry. Rightly so, this makes Paul furious. They are humiliating the poor among them and disgracing the tradition that Christ instituted. Therefore, Paul reminds the church of the holiness of the Lord's Supper. He calls the Corinthians to examine themselves as they eat and drink of the bread and drink. Otherwise, they are casting judgment upon themselves. Practically, Paul tells the Corinthians to eat their full meal at home and enjoy the privilege of the Lord's Supper for what it is, a holy act of remembering Christ. Communion is a precious privilege for us, and Paul calls the Corinthians not to take this privilege in vain. Loving others is loving Christ. Honoring others is honoring Christ. Our actions matter. They are symbolic of what we believe. This makes me think of Proverbs 4:23 that says, "Guard your heart above all else, for it is the source of life." Paul's words to the Corinthians echo the words he's written so far in this letter. Your freedom in Christ should not trample on others. A woman's freedom in Christ does not justify her dishonoring her husband. A believer's freedom to participate in communion does not allow him to freely partake at the expense of another. Paul is knitting the Corinthian church together in honor of not only each other, but of Christ. We behold Jesus as the head of his church today. And for his glory, I am recording this podcast right now. For his glory. Jesus is the reason we honor others, because he has so graciously honored us with salvation. Salvation we do not deserve. Jesus is the reason we have hope, joy, and peace. He is the reason that churches gather together to proclaim his name. Throughout 1 Corinthians, Paul is reconfiguring the Corinthians' spiritual compass around their true north, Jesus. Jesus is the reason we're here. May we use our freedom in Christ to glorify him and not ourselves. May we behold Christ's goodness and mercy and honor him with every facet of our lives.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. Don't forget to check out the show notes for helpful links and resources related to today's episode. And make sure you are following at Daily Grace Podcast on Instagram for more A Year in the Bible content, and at the Daily Grace Co. for all things Bible study resources. We can't wait to study again with you tomorrow. Bye, friends.